Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining the show. And I got a really special guest with me that I've had on before. And this guy, he fascinates me in the amount of information he knows. This is WODY, Odyssey Radio, and it's out of Bel Air, Maryland. And Eddie is the network guy, Eddie Carson's. My name is Dave Emmons, and this is going to be called the Dave Emmons Show. And I think the network is thinking about running the show between 9 and 11 in the evening. So if I say good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, it'll probably be 9 to 11 in the evening when the show runs. And we want to have some really good shows to let people know the truth. Just let them hear the truth for a change. I mean, if you go on the videos now on Facebook, you hear all kinds of stuff going on. So this show, we're going to try to get to the truth, and we're going to deal in all sorts of things. And the guy that I got with me, David White, he's an award-winning writer. I've seen some of his writing. It's outstanding. Chicago Advertiser. He's a publisher, and he's a he completed screenplays and novels. So, and he's had 3 UFO sightings, and he had a man in black, men in black, 1960s Cadillac witness one night that situation. He's multiple events with disembodied voices, numerous near-death objects, and remote viewing. So he gets into a lot of stuff. And precognitive, mostly through dreams, researcher in ancient archaeology, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Knights Templar, that's what excited me when I first met him. We talked a little bit about that, but we don't know how much time we're going to have to tap into David's mind and find out what's going on with all these things. So he's a great writer. He's had experience in just about everything that you can think about, and a great investigator. David White, bringing you on the show. David, is there anything I left off?
Yes, people can find me on Twitter at Templar Scribe, Templar.
Okay.
S is Sam, Cribe.
Right.
There's a link there to my latest vocal.media story called The Horde of Jacalus. It's actually a fantasy science fiction type story. So you can go to those links and see some of the other things that I discuss. I'm heavily invested these days in this phenomena called nubs, which are these little protruding chins that are on megalithic stonework around the world. And they seem to have no purpose, but they seem to be significant to whoever was doing the building circa 10 or 12,000 BC.
So have you seen these sites personally? You've just been examining them and talking to archaeologists and gathering research.
Right. So the way I got into ancient archaeology was kind of a circuitous route. I had been studying UFOs ever since I was a kid. I always wanted to see them. My father was very interested in science fiction. He used to tell me, he asked me this same question multiple times when I was a kid: what's the fastest way to travel in the universe? And your normal response would be, oh, faster than light travel, warp speed. And his answer was always thought. You can think yourself from one point in the universe to the other, which I kind of felt was, okay, that's an interesting response. And I had studied UFOs up until about 1993, when I had this Men in Black experience in Downers Grove, Illinois, along with 4 other people, all adults, who had seen this pristine black Cadillac sitting out front of my rented house in the suburb of Downers Grove. And the guy behind the wheel was completely hairless. He looked as white as a cue ball. He had stuck his head out the window and was looking back over his shoulder at me as he pulled the car from a parking spot into traffic and drove away, and never looked forward while he was doing that. And that moment so freaked me out that I decided I needed to study something else other than UFOs for a while. So I got into ancient archaeology, and I mean like Sumerian, Egyptian. There's a term in Egyptian archaeology called Zeptepi, which means the first time. And that refers to the first time that the waters subsided. There is a legend that there were, well, as some books describe it, there were 3 levels of gods in Egypt. The first level of gods, the oldest ones, were the bird-headed gods. This is something that Thoth, the Egyptian god of the scribe of the gods, discussed and taught to the early First Dynasty Egyptians. These bird-headed gods lived thousands of years, and then something happened. They got bored or something, and they left. And the people that took over were described with an Egyptian term called the crew. And the crew term actually refers to the crew that rowed the boats for the Pharaoh up and down the Nile. That was the second group of gods. And when they sort of got tired of ruling for thousands of years, they left the rulership to their children, the offspring of the crew. And that's the gods that we traditionally think of as the gods of Egypt, which is Osiris and Isis and those people. They were the third group of gods. It's
Now, David,
interesting.
I often wondered that ISIS, this terror group, did they name themselves after that ISIS god?
I don't believe so. I believe it was, if I remember correctly, it's an anachronism. Or it's a shortened version of like the new
Osiris?
no, not it's like a shortened version. It just happens to be ISIS.
Okay. All right.
It's
Could you
a
explain
shortened
nubs
version.
also? Nubs is probably the audience probably needs to know that.
So
I've never heard of it. I guess I love what you're talking about. I mean, this is my
right.
field of dreams, what you're saying. So what are
So
nubs?
there's a really good book, and I'm going to pull it off my bookshelf right now because I want to make sure I've got the right name. So it's by a guy named Andrew Collins. It's called The Gods of Eden. And he talks about all of this. He talks about Zep-Tepi. He talks about the first gods. It's interesting that when he wrote this book, and when we were first, for the last, couple hundred years discussing the bird-headed gods, this was long before we found the huge sites in Turkey that are associated with Göbekli Tepe and Keraton Tepe and all these other sites. There's now hundreds of these circular worship centers throughout the Turkish area. And on one of these most famous pillars at Göbekli Tepe, there's birds. They look like giant, it's hard to describe what kind of bird they are, but they're definitely connected with the sky, and they seem to be connected with something in the sky, almost like they're pointing to.
Right.
Some people have suggested that this bird refers to Cygnus, which is a constellation in the sky that looks like a giant swan or bird.
Right.
And they one of the theories currently is that this object in the sky, this round sphere, was this incoming asteroid or giant meteorite that impacted the Earth and caused a giant devastation that ended the Lesser Dryas somewhere around 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago.
Right.
And this is a theory that was completely poo-pooed and denigrated for the last 20 years. Graham Hancock, the really good writer and researcher, tried to get on TED Talk and talk about this, and they wouldn't let him discuss it because they considered it, quote, pseudo-archaeology. Well, we have since figured out that actually there's a lot of evidence that supports that there was a giant cataclysm at that time. One of the really interesting things is there are remains of woolly mammoths in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, which died with buttercups in their bellies. And the problem is, where would a woolly mammoth get buttercups north of the Arctic Circle? Except that at that time, buttercups did grow there because it was warmer. It was not the kind of cold temperature that we think of now. And the problem is, when they died, it appears they were flash frozen, like they were instantly put in a massive deep freeze. And one of the possible ways that that could have happened is if something impacted into the glacial ice sheets in Canada and around the North Pole and sent that ice, flying in the air and landing in the area where the mammoths were and froze them, literally in their tracks.
So that was 12,000 years ago or more.
Well, it's kind of hard to tell. We still aren't sure if we have an impact site. There's been some discussion about some impact sites that they found in northern Greenland, but the time frame doesn't quite match. So we're a little unsure whether this is the proof we're looking for, the so-called smoking gun, or if because it hit the ice, it won't leave an impact. But we are certain that from around 10,000 BC, the ocean levels rose as much as 300 feet in a very short period of time. Some people have suggested it was as short as a week. Other people have suggested it was as long as a month. The thing is, at that time, circa 10,000 BC, a lot of the civilization that we think of as, people that lived at that time would have lived along the ocean shore or in shallow areas next to water. And if the water level rose 300 feet, all of those civilization areas would have just been wiped out.
Yeah.
And it would have been worldwide. And that suggests that maybe these legends of a worldwide flood, although not as high as, say, Mount Ararat, but high enough to, for example, overflow the Persian Gulf, where the Sumerians claim their first 5 cities are buried under the water, and that the 5 holy cities that they had in the beginning of their time period were actually rebuilt cities to replace the ones that were lost from this flood. We also know that the Black Sea was inundated by a huge rush of water about this time. We can now see that there are city layouts below the waterline, as much as 200 feet below the water. We've also found a city off the coast of India that's 3 miles long and 1 mile wide, with what appears to be a very structured north, south, east, west street layout with what appears to be depressions in the middle for an open sewer system. But it's 200 feet below the water line. So it has to have existed before this calamity caused the ocean levels to rise.
You think that was the snow caps in the South Antarctica and the Arctic that melted? Or is
No, not in the south, in the north, in Greenland.
okay.
Sorry, not Greenland, Greenland and Canada. There's a really interesting feature to the west around the Columbia River Valley in Washington State called the Scablands, which is this eroded area after an ice dam broke and this huge meltwater lake that was under the glaciers in eastern Washington State and southwestern Canada. When that broke, the Scablands were scoured out by this massive rushing of water, and it deposited boulders on top of cliffs and things like that. It was just a huge rush of water. There is a Scablands in eastern Canada that makes that look like a tributary. And it's vast. I mean, it's hundreds of miles wide, and it's a huge gouge of water. So either something broke a meltwater dam of this glacier that was underneath the glacier, or it literally just melted the glaciers, and all that water poured into the Atlantic and eventually filled up the other oceans around the rest of the world and raised the water level between 200 and 400 feet in a very short period of time.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories on that. They claim that the Atlanteans had a battle with another ET race, and I guess they melted the ice caps, and the biblical, I guess the historical biblical flood that's what you're talking about, that happened about 12,000 years ago, right?
Well, see, that's the other problem. The Bible isn't always accurate numerically. We'd like
Right.
to think that the Bible is telling us what happened back in ancient times, but it's really, as far as the Old Testament goes, it really only goes back to the time of Abraham, which is only about 1600 to 1700 BC.
Right.
And the secondary problem with that is Abraham moves from Ur, the city in Samaria where his family came from, and moves into the Holy Land. And then his tribe, because there's not enough water and resources to supply the Israelites, they move to Egypt. And by the time they leave Egypt, at least 200 years has passed. They go back to the Holy Land. This is the time of Exodus. And they built a civilization centered around the temple in Jerusalem. And another 600 years at least goes by before they are captured and brought into captivity in Babylon. And then, and only then, do they actually start writing things down. Up till then, all of this has been transmitted orally from generation to generation. And after 600 years, it's possible they got some things wrong.
So the ancient Sumerians had the first writing ability. When did that start?
Well, as far back as 30-something hundred BC, 36, 3700 BC, it's possible that there are other older writing civilizations. We just haven't found their documents or their monuments with the writing on them. But the Sumerian civilization and the first dynasty of Egypt both seem to have originated around 4000 BC, which is interesting because that was about 6,000 years after we think Göbekli Tepe was at its height,
Right.
and roughly around 6,000 years after this devastation that ended the Lesser Dryas.
Right.
So it's interesting that one of the best books that I could, urge people to read is Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods. And I don't like the title. It's too much of a ripoff on Chariots of the Gods. That's the only criticism I have of the book. The book itself is really good. It talks about how there were a series or a continuing, I don't want to call it an infestation, but a continuing reappearance of bearded white men all across the globe who had the ability to be like gods to the locals. They taught them their language, they taught them math and measurement, they taught them geography, they taught them husbandry, they taught them irrigation, they taught them how to grow crops. And it starts with, in Sumeria, this fellow named Oannes, O-A-N-N-E-S, who is carved in stone as being a man with a fish suit, a complete scaled fish suit, including the tail down by his feet, and a hood thrown back over his head. If you had to show somebody who didn't understand modern technology, a guy in a scuba suit that went into the water and came back out, you couldn't do any better than show this, a man in a fish suit.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Oannes is a bearded white guy that came up out of the water. Thoth, or Thoth, the scribe of the Egyptian gods, was the same thing. He was a bearded white man that came out of the ocean, taught the Egyptians everything, and then left the same way he arrived. Viracocha in South America is another one. And Graham Hancock recounts this story that the Inca were told by their ancestors that when Viracocha, whose name means foam of the sea, when he was trying to help the locals there, for whatever reason, they got mad at him and they were going to stone him to death. And as Graham Hancock relates this ancient legend, this fellow fell to his knees, put his hands up to the heavens, and implored the gods to rain fire down on the locals. And when he did this, the locals decided not to stone him to death after all.
Right. Yeah.
And then when he gets done helping them, and Hancock describes all the things that Viracocha could do. They literally terraced mountains and built walls and made cities and improved life for everybody. When he was done, he walked into the ocean and left. And that's why he's called Foam of the Sea, Viracocha.
Right. Now, Graham Hancock, David, he's the guy that's with Ancient Aliens now. Does he
he's on a lot of shows. I'm pretty sure he's on Ancient Aliens too.
And also these tall white guys with beards. Could you, I mean, like me, my beginning started all with alien abductions and everything, and got the book out about that. But do you think that they were aliens from another planet?
Well, people who research this hesitate to start describing anything that they can't prove by physical evidence. So you're asking us to take a leap beyond what the evidence will tell us. What I'd rather focus on is, what does the evidence say?
Okay.
The megalithic stonework says that somebody had high-level technology beyond, hammer and stones and bronze tools. For example, there's another fellow that is really popular on YouTube, Brian Forrester. His first name is spelled B-R-I-E-N. He started off as a tour guide in Peru and South America, and he has since traveled around the world. He's pointed out that in the Cairo Museum, there is a solid block of granite where the builders, whoever they were going to cut one side off and use that as a top. This block of granite weighs somewhere between 60 and 70 tons. Okay, this is a massive block of granite.
Right.
And in order to cut the top off of this thing, they had 2 6-foot saw blades running parallel, one right on top of the other, like I don't know how you describe it, like a tire next to a tire.
Right.
And at some point, something happened, and the 2 saw blades dove into the stone and snapped off the piece. So they just said, well, screw it, we'll just find another block of granite. And they went to something else. But that block of granite is now sitting in a museum in Cairo, and you can tell by the groove marks that that was a 6-foot saw blade, and not just one, but a second one running right next to it. There is no way the dynastic Egyptians had that technology. None. At the same time, you can find core drilling areas where they core drilled into granite and marble, and you can actually count the revolutions where they core drilled into these hard stones, and it's 10 times better than the best diamond drills we have now. Those two facts alone show that somebody had high-level technology before the Egyptians, before the dynastic Egyptians, prior to 4000 BC.
Okay,
There are,
and leaving out the ET theory, I'll do that and let you get into the archaeology. I won't poison the water here on this one. But
okay,
where do you think that ancient technology come from? Were they here years and thousands of years ago?
that's not the question I wanted David Hatcher Childress to answer. So I asked David Hatcher Childress this past Saturday when we had a birthday party for him at his bookstore in Kempton, Illinois. I said, are you willing to accept that there is worldwide evidence of advanced technology? Oh, yes, absolutely. Are you willing to accept that this is definitely not the people that we consider, for example, the Egyptians or the Inca, that this predated them for thousands of years? Absolutely. Would you be willing to also accept that whatever technology seems to have been picked up and they took it away as if they just didn't want to play with us anymore? Well, I don't know about that. And I started talking to him about a number of different sites that show what appears to be that these builders, whatever technology they were using, decided to just stop working all of a sudden and leave. And they took everything with them. There are a number of sites across the world where it looks like their work just stopped. There's a really fascinating place at Saqqara in Egypt called the Serapeum, which is an underground collection of rooms with these giant 80 and 90-ton blocks of black granite that are just maneuvered into these tight little rooms in a way that, you know, you couldn't get 2,000 men to do this if that's what you were trying to do. And they've polished these things to a beautiful sheen, and only a few of them have hieroglyphics carved in them, and the hieroglyphics look like they were done with a nail. They're not good hieroglyphics. They're afterons. Somebody got in there later and decided they were going to scratch their name on it like graffiti. But in the middle of the hallway, between all of these perpendicular rooms, somebody left one of these blocks just sitting there blocking the hallway. There's barely enough room on one side to squeeze past. Further down that hallway is the lid for this same box. And the box is not polished, which means that when they polished these, they did so only after they were put into their little niches. And the other odd thing is there's no carbon buildup on the ceiling, which means they were not using torches to do this. Mm. But the problem is, why would they have just stopped and left this there? There's another site called Ollantaytambo in South America, in Peru, that is this beautiful, they call it the Temple of the Sun, this beautiful wall of carved stone on the top of this cliff. The stone was carved from another mountaintop down the hillside, across this valley, and up another hillside. Some of these blocks weigh 80 to 90 tons.
Right.
There's a block halfway in between that looks like it was meant to go up to this mountaintop, and they left it there. They just dropped it. They call that the lazy stone, as if the stone didn't have enough energy to get the heck up the hill by itself. There are also a number of blocks of stone around the top of Ollantaytambo that some people have suggested it looks like they were blown apart from, excuse me, from the stone carvings, but there's no evidence on any of the stones of anything like damage or vitrification, melting of the stone, or scoring or blackening. It looks like they had all these stones ready to pile up like a Tetris thing, and they just stopped.
There's been a lot of ancient civilizations, David, that just disappeared. It's like the Hopi in our West here in the U.S. and all around the world. It seems like sometimes they just threw their hands up and left. Everybody was gone.
Well, except that in those instances, we can generally attribute that to natural influences, droughts or floods or what have you. In these instances, it looks like they stopped working on like a lunch break and never came back. And it's possible, this is a very big jump of thinking. It's possible that what the Göbekli Tepe statues are showing us, what the stone carvings are showing us, was that there was a incoming meteor or some bolide, some object from space that the smart enough people who could see it coming realized it was going to really screw things up. And they decided they weren't going to be here for that. They gathered everything up and they left in a hurry.
Right.
And didn't finish any of these projects. One of the most interesting ones is the north face of Menkare's pyramid at Giza. Menkare's pyramid is the third, the smallest, the most southwestern one. Across its northern face, it has a few rows left of this beautiful pink granite. It looks just great, except they smoothed down a whole bunch of these stones from top to bottom over 4 or 5 courses, but didn't do the rest. It's like they only wanted to do a little, and then it was like, oh, it's lunchtime, we got to go, and we're going to come back the next day, and never finished.
I know we were talking earlier about the real thin lines that these big stones are. You can't get a credit card through them. And are they those laser cuts or those saw cuts?
Well, they may be something else.
Yeah.
Which we'll have to get to
Right.
a little later.
Okay.
Because
Yeah, we're going to take a pause right now. You're listening to WODY radio, and that's Odyssey Radio out of Maryland. And my guest today is David White. We got more to go. And my name's Dave Emmons, and this is Dave Emmons Show. Be right back. Hi, and welcome back. This is Dave Emmons, the Dave Emmons Show, and it's WODY Odyssey Radio out of Maryland. And my guest today is David White. Glad you can stick around for the second segment. We got 4 segments of this show, so stick around. You're going to hear a lot of interesting things. And David, you wanted to talk more about this ancient archaeology. It's very, very interesting, very exciting.
So one of the things that we're discussing a lot in Twitter these days is this enigmatic feature of a lot of megalithic stonework around the world called nubs, or some people call them chins. And they're little knobs on the outside of otherwise perfectly finished stones that seem to show no purpose. Some people have suggested, well, that's where they used poles or something to help put these rocks in place, except some of these rocks are 30 or 40 tons. Some of them are even more than that, 80 to 100 tons. And some of the biggest nubs are on natural stone features like granite outcroppings, where you aren't going to move them anyway. They're not going to move. So the discussion about these nubs has gone back and forth about whether they're intentional, whether they were going to be removed when the builders were done. But what I think is interesting is if you look at Sacsayhuaman, which has thousands of stones, some of them really big, some of them really old. They appear to have started not with nubs, but with rectangular cutouts, like a depression, like somebody had put their thumb in the stone. And the oldest stones, the biggest ones and the lower ones, have these rectangular cutouts that are emplaced in what looks to be the natural stone facing that used to be on the side of a cliff on a mountain some miles away. And it looks like the builders cut these blocks off because they appreciated the natural beauty of the weathering of the stones and placed them at Sacsayhuaman. And then at the bottom, they put these little rectangles almost as an indication of the device they used to cut the stone with. And only later, when they started using stones that they were going to smooth the face off of, do they then leave a nub in place to show how much of the stone was removed. And they don't do it on all the stones, they only do it on a few. And there's another site at Sacsayhuaman that's kind of in the front of this big curved hill. At the top of this hill, there are any number of stone outcroppings, natural ones from that area, a kind of a hardened limestone, where people took whatever tools they were using to cut the stone with, and it looks like they were practicing. They did stairways, they did chairs, they did cross hatching, they did flat stones on the side of a natural outcropping. They put stuff everywhere, but it doesn't serve the same kind of purpose that the dragon tooth wall at Sacsayhuaman does. it almost looks like somebody was teaching them how to use the tools. And only when they were a high enough skill level did they let them put that kind of work onto the stones that became the Sacsayhuaman walls. And it's possible that they left these stone nubs as sort of an autograph, that I helped on this one, I helped on this one. You can then see these nubs in a lot of other locations, not only in Egypt, for example, at the Osirian, which is an underground stone temple. We think that was predating the Egyptians by thousands of years, although we aren't 100% certain. We can see them on some of Menkaure pyramids casing stones, where they left these same kind of nubs in place, almost as proof that somebody was here, and then they just didn't carve them away. There is a place in Cusco City proper that was the home of a beautiful curved stone wall with just the most beautiful polished stone. And on the inside, there are so we see these nubs around the world, not just here, but in Japan, in China, in India, in Turkey, in Indonesia. And it almost looks like it's a worldwide agreement that we're going to let the locals help build. And when we do, we will display how much stone was cut away. Now, you were asking before, what kind of technology would they have used? Would they have used lasers? There is this legend about Solomon, who built the first temple, having a device called a shamir, which is alternately described as a snake or a worm. Sometimes it's described as fitting around his finger like a ring, and that it had two eyes that sent out a red beam of light with which he could cut stone. That's one story. There's another
one
story.
person that he gave that information to is Hiram Bliss, the head architecture person there with Solomon's Temple, and he gave that information to him, and that's what started this whole thing with the Masonic Temple, is that Hiram Bliss was killed because he would not relinquish the information that was passed on to him. Is that right?
Hiram Abiff.
Abiff, okay.
Abiff, A-B-I-F, like that. Yes, I was a Freemason for a while. I studied a lot of Masonic stories. There's another great book I would recommend is Born in Blood. Horrible title, great book, by a guy named John Robinson, who was so impressed with the things he found out about Freemasonry that he joined the Masons after he wrote this book. And what he is able to prove is that in the middle 1300s in England, there's a revolt called the Peasants' Revolt. And what they were revolting against was this concept of serfdom, where if you were a serf in medieval Europe, you were basically a slave that could be killed on sight if you were found outside of your town that you were assigned to. So you couldn't travel at all. And you were basically not a free man, you were a slave. Well, along comes the Peasant Revolt, and these peasants decide they're going to upheave the whole system. So they go from town to town, pulling out the rolls that lists who's a free man and who's a serf, and they burn them in the city square. Or sometimes they burn them in the building where they're being held, and they burn the building to the ground. But what's interesting is if they found these, and this is about 3 generations after the Knights Templar went underground, which happened in 1307. So if they found a holding that used to be a Templar holding in England, they would spare it and they would take the documents out. But if they found a holding that was being held by the Knights Hospitaller, who were the antagonists of the Knights Templar, who inherited, some say stole, the Templar holdings when the Templars went underground, if they found these documents there, they'd burn that building to the ground. They had an intense hatred for the Hospitallers. And at a point in time, there was an agreed peace treaty meeting between the King of England and the leaders of this peasants' revolt, where the King of England decided to betray his oath of peace and murder them all, except for a few that they tortured to get the truth out of them. And they admitted, yes, we're part of a secret organization. As far as John Robinson is concerned, this is the first hint that there is a secret organization trying to make all men free. And from there, he points out that you can see how Scotland seems to have been a home for the Knights Templar because of a famous battle called the Battle of Bannockburn, which happens 7 years after the Templars go underground. And there is a very good reason that they went to Scotland, because Scotland was under a papal edict at the time, because Robert the Bruce had pretty much done the same thing that the King of England did. He had a peace meeting with a rival, and he wound up murdering the rival at a church, which was supposed to be
Yeah.
no good. Don't do
Yeah.
that.
No.
So the Pope excommunicated the entire country of Scotland, which was a great thing for the Templars. So when the Templars needed a place to hide from the Pope, what better place to go to than Scotland?
And did they carry all their treasure with them?
Well, I've started a novel. Actually,
Yeah.
I started a trio of novels. I've written the first book called Eternal Horizons: On the Trail of the Templar Treasure. And in the entire first book of 85,000 words or so, they still haven't found it. So we don't know for sure where this treasure went. There are a number of good possibilities, but so far nobody really knows.
People out there, when David talks about writing books, I've read some of his writings, and he is an excellent writer. And I know that if you went and bought those books and read what he talks about, he's a fantastic writer. I've written a couple of books and on my third book, but I'm not in that level where David is with all these novels that he writes and screenplays. So yeah,
So we were talking about Solomon,
right,
and the first temple. And the legend of the first temple was that it could only house the Ark of the Covenant if it was a building built without metal tools, which is why he has to use the sapphire. And also while there's a concurrent legend that he had figured out a way to imprison demons and make the demons do the work for him. But if you step back from those legends and look at them with modern eyes, it's possible that what we're seeing is people at that time, say 1500 BC or so, 1400 BC, that they don't understand how something like this could have been built with human hands. Ergo, it must have been either angels or demons,
right.
And for whatever reason, they ascribed it to demons. Now, you were asking before also, what could have cut these stones?
Yes.
Well, we've got the shamir, which has these two red laser-like eyes that reportedly could cut stone very easily. There's another really interesting ancient legend in South America about the children of the sun that were supposedly the son's daughter and son and husband and wife. They were both the same thing, pretty much like the ruling Egyptian pharaohs had to marry one of the women, one of the female people in line to the throne, because that's the only way they could be considered legitimate rulers of the land. So they would sometimes marry their mother, they would marry their sister or their daughter, whoever it was, so that they could inherit the throne.
Keep it in the blood.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So these two people come out of Lake Titicaca, which is on the border between Peru and Bolivia, and they start walking north, and they have two magic sort of items with them. One of them is a golden rod, which they are supposed to push into the ground. And when this golden rod sinks easily into the ground and disappears, that's where they're going to found their holy city. And they walk from Lake Titicaca all the way north to the valley where Cusco is. And supposedly the golden rod goes into the ground and disappears, and that's where they're going to build Cusco. What's interesting about that story is that Cusco happens to lie on a line that goes entirely around the earth that includes some of the most major sites of ancient times, including Angkor Wat, including Giza, and interestingly enough, Easter Island. Now, if you were going to draw a line around the earth and you were going to hit an island, you're going to have to start knowing where that island is first. You can't, for example, build Giza and then Cusco, and then I'm going to pick an island. Well, you can't do that with Easter Island. It's too small. You'd have to know Easter Island was there first. And what's interesting is we now know, this has only come out, I think, in the last 20 years or so, there is at least one wall section on Easter Island that looks identical to the kind of stonework that's built in Cusco and other megalithic sites in South America, in Central America, in Egypt, and elsewhere. Somebody was on that island before Cusco was founded. And what they were doing was almost as if it was a GPS device. They knew where Cusco was, they knew where Giza was, and they kept walking until they intersected that line, and that's where they picked Cusco.
Now, some people would theorize that they had energy or power that was coming off of the pyramids, and it would be transmitted around the world, and that's how they trace that line. I saw a documentary on that. I know there's different opinions and what's going on, but I watch all this stuff because I'm curious, and I know
Right.
you dig into it deeper than I do, David.
Right.
Continue on, brother.
So as I mentioned, this Children of the Sun pairing had two magical devices. One was this golden rod. The other one was something called the axe of gold, or the axe of the gods. And this axe supposedly could cut stone like butter. Now, why that's interesting is because we now have a device called a plasma cutter, which you can attune this device to cut anything without touching what's underneath. And it doesn't actually cut it, it sublimates it, which means it turns that matter into a gas and it's gone. It's like a powder, it's gone. One of the interesting things that we've noticed about these megalithic stone sites around the world is there are no debris fields where these giant megaliths are built. If they had taken an 80-ton block of stone and chipped off a ton or 2 tons, there'd be 2 tons of stone laying around somewhere, but there's not. We can see these debris fields in places like in Egypt and in Greece and in Rome, where they built things out of limestone, for example, and knocked all this stone away with other harder stones like andesite balls. And yes, there's a giant debris field. But there are places like, there's a place in China called the Longyu Caves. These caves are these massive underground structures. There's at least 20 of them that we know of so far, where they removed more than 1 million cubic feet of stone, which means we should have 1 million cubic feet debris pile somewhere, and we don't.
Wow.
There's the Yangshan quarry in China, where again they have knobs on the outside of these stone outcroppings that go 2 or 3 feet long, which means they had to have carved 2 or 3 feet away from the stone all the way around, 300 or 400 feet on a side. Where's the debris field? There's none. If they were using a plasma cutting torch that could be tuned so that it sublimated the material underneath it, that would explain why there are nubs on some of these stones. Because what they were saying was, we got rid of all this stone. It was so easy. We'll show you just how much we got rid of. And that would explain places like Machu Picchu or Sacsayhuaman, where these massive blocks of stone don't have flat lines between them. It's easy for anybody to create a flat line stone structure, but they have curves, almost like waves, where the one on top perfectly matches the curving wave underneath. The only way they could have done that is with technology that could cut both stones at the same time. And if they brought something from like on top and from the left, or on top and from the right, and settled it onto this cutting device, then it could cut both stones at the same time.
Right.
Now,
The
that's a
debris
huge
field.
jump.
Yeah, David, the debris field that you're talking about is Stonehenge. I think they had to go, what, how many miles to find where they were getting the stone for Stonehenge? And they had to carry these megalithic stones. I mean, weigh
Yes,
tons. They found that debris field, right?
they did. Yes, they did. Except notice those stones aren't quite put together the way the stones say at
Sure.
Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo or Machu Picchu. And the other thing that's interesting is you can look at Machu Picchu, you can look at Sacsayhuaman, you can look at the buildings in Cusco proper, and you can tell that there were 2 at least levels of civilization. There's the megalithic stones, which fit together precisely, that are massive blocks of stone. And then there are the Inca stones, which are much more manageable. 2 or 3 men could pick them up and move them. And they're not cut precisely. They're kind of wedged in place, and they have little filler stones in between them. And that's not the same architecture at all. That's not the same. I don't even think that's the same millennia at all.
Right.
And the Inca themselves have admitted in their legends that the Spanish wrote down when they first met them, that these buildings were found, that the Inca found them and put some of them back together as best they could, and then put more stones around the outside. Brian Forrester does an excellent job in showing this is Inca, this is Spanish, this is neither. This is far better than even the Spanish could do. The Spanish, the best they could do is kind of glue things together with concrete and then put, plaster over the whole thing. Nobody can do the kind of stonework that these builders could do.
Yeah, I've
But the
seen that.
interesting
Yeah.
thing is, and the one thing I tried to get David Hatcher Childress to accept publicly is that we know that they had high-level technology. We know that they had dual running 6-foot saw blades. We know that they had the ability to cut stone without leaving a debris field. We know that they could carve incredibly precise straight lines that are so sharp to this day that you can cut your finger on them. And we know that they could do core drilling with an advancement in a rate of drilling that's better than what we can do today with diamond tip drills. The problem is, where did all that technology go? And why does it look like it stops suddenly and never started again? And why does it look like it stops suddenly in multiple places around the earth?
Interesting.
This is not like, the Aztec, running out of resources, or the Maya suffering a drought and having to go to some place that's wetter. It looks like this technology is just stopped on an afternoon and they gathered up all their tools. There's not a battery left. There's not a bolt or a screw or a saw blade. It's like they policed the area perfectly because we weren't allowed to have this technology. That's what it looks like.
And they left
And
a few Stone Age tools laying around that we know was impossible for them to do that with the tools that they had or were supposed to
right,
have had.
right.
Right.
So one of the other things that you can see at these megalithic sites around the world is something called vitrification, which is basically melting of stone.
Right.
Except it's very precise vitrification. In some places, it looks like it was part of the finishing. There's a stone wall in Cusco City that has what looks like somebody took a knife and just smoothed some of the stones like they were iced over like a cake. And this is vitrified stone. This is not an accident. This is something to do with whatever tools they were using when they were cutting the stone. And it's possible if you were using some kind of plasma device and you didn't have it set right, it's possible that instead of cutting the stone, you melted the stone. And it's possible that this is an accident. We've seen other places where a stone looks like it was attacked by a plasma burst, except it's really tightly contained. It looks like it hits 1.5 stones, but nothing below it and nothing above it or to the side. It's almost like somebody threw a mini fireball at just this one stone. Now, there have been people, including Brian Forrester, who says this is signs of a solar plasma display. Except if we're talking about a solar plasma burst hitting the Earth, it would hit a lot more than 1.5 stones. It would hit hundreds and hundreds of square miles at the same time. It would melt every stone, not just one or two.
Mm-hmm.
Another place that's really interesting that Brian's shown videos of is Tanis in Egypt, which is a completely destroyed ancient city. And one of the things that he focuses on very rightly is this massive 80-ton block of stone that's carved into a sitting figure. We think it's a pharaoh. But the problem is the front of this stone looks like it was hit by something from the sky that melted much of the stone and burned a lot of the rest. But then it only affects parts of the two sides and doesn't affect the back. And if this was a solar plasma burst that hit this thing, it would not be so tightly contained. And my thought is that if there's a lot of ifs in this next statement, if we accept that this civilization was advanced enough to see whatever was coming that created the devastation that ended the Lesser Dryas, that might be represented on this pillar at Göbekli Tepe with the bird with the outstretched hands saying, look at this thing in the sky. If that's what happened, and these people had to leave in a hurry, which it sure seems like they did, and the locals realized these guys were taking all their toys and leaving with them, the locals might have gotten a little upset. And it's entirely possible that some of the people who had been trained in using these tools turned the tools against them. We go back again to this legend that Graham Hancock talks about in Fingerprints of the Gods, where the locals turned against Viracocha and were going to kill him. and then there was fire in the sky, and then Viracocha left. And if you look at the way that some of the legends in the Bible are recorded, and sometimes they get a little misunderstood or they get a little remembered out of order, you could conceivably see that this is a retelling of the time that Viracocha left and the locals got mad and the fire in the sky came down and then he's gone. And so are the tools, and so is all their technology and their advancements and everything. And it's
So,
going to be 6,000 years before they come back.
yeah, so I have to ask you a question. They must have had the knowledge to fly or to leave this planet if they've had all that
Yes.
kind of knowledge. And that's what
Yep.
they did. They left that they were actually not ETs, but they were actually here on Earth for a long time themselves, and they were actually part of our civilization, and they just left with their own technology.
They appear to have the technology that allowed them to teleport from location to location. In Pumapunku, which is completely destroyed by a massive tsunami that came from Lake Titicaca over a mile away, and it's now, most of it is still not recovered. It's still buried underneath all of this mud and dirt. There are not just precise corners, but it's one of the very few locations that appears to just be built as if they had doorways. It's just a series of doorways. And there were some doorways in the nearby city that the locals were allowed to go to. They weren't allowed to go to Pumapunku. But the doorway of the sun that has been re-established there that had fallen over, the locals claim that the gods could walk into this doorway and disappear and go instantly over to Pumapunku. There's other doorways that have been carved in other places outside of Cusco, where supposedly, according to the ancient legends, they would put a crystal into this little recess and they would step in and teleport away.
So
Now,
you're saying the teleportation was from one spot on Earth to another spot, not necessarily out in outer space.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying the legends say that.
Right.
Okay, and the legends aren't necessarily clear about where they go to. We don't have any, and the other interesting thing is, while there are knobs all over the place in all of these megalithic structures, including, as I said, Turkey and India and Indonesia and South America and Japan and China, one of the few places that doesn't have nubs is Pumapunku, which is one of the very few sites where only the gods were allowed. And if only the gods were allowed there, it's possible that none of the locals were allowed to go there and help build. And that's why you don't see any nubs there, because they didn't help build that. These guys did.
Wow. That's a lot of investigating, David.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't heard that angle of it, but I'm really impressed with this extra option that we have to look at, that how all this happened and occurred, not just from ETs coming down in their ships and then helping them, but they were here all this time.
Absolutely. Although you didn't hear me say ETs.
Yeah, okay. You've been listening to WODY Radio, Odyssey Radio, and it's out of Maryland. And our guest is David White. Very interesting conversations about something that we all are interested in. I think all of us are, ancient archaeology. My name is Dave Emmons. Dave Emmons Show. We'll be right back. We got another whole hour to go. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, and hopefully that you're really excited about what we're covering here about the ancient archaeology and what intelligence might have done it. Besides the ETs coming down, there might have been people here already giving us that intelligence. And you're listening to David White as my guest. I'm Dave Emmons, and this is Dave Emmons Show, and it's WODY Radio, Odyssey Radio. And David, you have some experiences you want to talk about, so go ahead.
All righty. So it's hard for people who've never seen a UFO to really know how amazing and mystical it is when you see a UFO. The same thing happens with paranormal events. You might never believe that a ghost exists until you see one. You might never believe in seeing the future until you have a dream where that dream comes true. And then you become a believer. Since a young age, since I was a little kid, I've had precognitive dreams where it's almost like deja vu on steroids, where you have a dream where you see something, you see people, you hear a conversation, and then a day or two or a week or a month later, that same thing happens. I kind of believe that that's what deja vu is. It's us visiting our future timelines, that we want to remember we saw this moment so that when we see it in real life, it's like hitting a trail sign that says you're on the right path. Okay, so this is going to be a long story. I'm going to try to fit it into the next 25 minutes. This goes back to 1991 in June in Chicago, when the Bulls, the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan, were playing in their very first championship. They were playing against the Los Angeles Lakers. They lost their first game. It wasn't close, but it was only because the refs in the NBA couldn't figure out how to blow a foul against the Lakers. They were knocking people down. They were knocking Scottie Pippen into the crowd. No fouls. So the Bulls lost handily. So I'm at the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show, hosting people from out of town. This is back when I worked for a magazine called Electronic Gaming Monthly, and I was one of the senior editors. So I was hosting some of these visiting dignitaries at one of Chicago's best restaurants, Gino's East on Superior. And we're in this big room with somewhere between 100 and 150 people. And there are booths along the outside of this large rectangle. And in the middle, there are 3 tables placed together. And at this table are about 10 or 12 very well decked out, very glamorous black and white ladies, and a bunch of old white men in suits, and one guy with a white afro, like a white man with a black afro at the end. And they're making all the jokes in the world that they can about the Bulls. And I'm listening to this, and being the Bulls fan that I am, I was getting a little upset. Nobody in the place was saying anything against them. They all had their heads down. Oh, the Bulls lost. Oh, the Bulls are going to lose 4 games in a row. Oh, they're going to get swept. And this knucklehead at the end of the table was just talking trash about the Bulls. And I finally just couldn't take it anymore. So I told the guys at the table, I said, excuse me, I got to do something. And I stood up and I went, hey, really loud. And everybody in the room jumped. And I said, you guys are guests in our town. You should be more respectful. You should be careful who you piss off, because sometimes that's going to come back and bite you in the ass. And everybody's like, yeah, you tell them. I said, you only won this game because the refs wanted to give you a hand. You know, they wanted to help you through one game. You didn't win this game. The refs won this game. And people are like, yeah, that's exactly right. And they're like cheering and stuff. And I said, and you of all people should know, Michael Jordan's the best player. He could beat this other team by himself. In fact, the Bulls are going to win the next game, and then they're going to win the next game, and the next game, and the next game. They're going to win the next 4 games, including 3 at your vaunted palace in Los Angeles, and they're going to sweep your butts right off this court. And the people in the audience are like, yeah, you tell them. And then I said, and when you lose that 4th game in a row at home, I want you to walk off that court. I want you to look up in the camera, and I want you to know that I'm looking right back at you, and I'm laughing my ass off at your stupid face. And as soon as I did that, everybody in the place went, yeah, and they cheered.
Except
and they,
for that table, yeah.
You know, they weren't throwing things, but it was as close to an eruption as you could possibly get. And the people at that table got really quiet, and they like put their heads down. And it took me a while to realize this was the coaching staff from the LA Lakers. This was the coaches' wives. And that stupid guy at the end that was making all the comments, he was the head ball boy.
Oh.
And from that moment on, the Bulls won the next game.
Yeah.
And then they won the first game in LA, and then they won the second game in LA, and then they won the third game in LA. And when this knucklehead walked off the court, he looked up at the camera and he went, oh, and like you could just see him like look down like, I forgot he told me he was going to be looking at it.
Yeah, you
And
cursed him.
the interesting thing that happens is I'm pretty sure that at some point in that next few hours after that dinner, that these ladies went back to their husbands and went, Sugar, there's some stupid white dude in this restaurant says you ain't going to win another game this playoff. And I'm sure after that they went, oh, don't worry, he's wrong. We're going to win. And then they lost again. And then the coaches went, you know, that guy did say we were going to lose 4 in a row. And then they went back to LA and they lost another game. And then it's like, oh my God, we lost 2 in a row. This isn't going to happen, is it? And they lost a 3rd game. And the Bulls got better and better because the refs let them play real basketball the way they really should. And then they lost a 3rd game in a row in LA. They lost 4 games in a row. and they won just like I said they were going to win. So I was pretty happy about that. I'm sure that this story has gotten from the Los Angeles Lakers and their player wives and the coaches back to the Bulls. And I'm sure the Bulls have probably heard this story once or twice too. So just wanted to say, hey, I'm on your side, guys. So the interesting thing about this is 1991. About 15 years later, 25 years later, in 2016, I was part of a group in Chicago that studied experiencer events, people who had seen UFOs, people who had had paranormal experiences. And I was invited to this get together on the north side of Chicago that this gentleman was holding. He was a twin brother who had lost his twin brother to cancer. And he, like Houdini, was trying to find somebody who could speak to the dead because he wanted to communicate to his dead brother. Unfortunately, I don't seem to have that capability. I have a lot of others, but I've never been able to talk to the dead. I don't know if it's a special trait you have to have or what. But one night after one of these meetings, he had a friend and his friend's friend and me together. We were talking, and this friend of his was a huge sports fan. And he was talking about all the great sporting events he'd seen. And we started talking about basketball. So I told him this story about how I sort of helped the Bulls win their first championship. Mm. And he's smiling and he's listening to me. When he gets done, he goes, yeah, that's a great story, but it never happened. I'm like, what do you mean it never happened? Well, the Bulls never won a championship. I'm like, excuse me, they won 6. They not only won 6, but they only lost 2 in the middle because Michael Jordan wanted to try to go off and hit a curveball with the White Sox. If he hadn't done that, they'd have probably won 8 in a row. No, 91, the Lakers beat Boston or something. It wasn't even the Bulls. It's like, are you nuts? And I realized, and he was serious. And the guy with him said, you better listen to him. This guy knows every sport backwards and forwards. He could tell you what the starting lineup was for the New York Yankees in 1985. He could tell you any stat you wanted to hear. He knows his stuff. And I realized as I'm looking at him, I said to myself, this guy's on a different timeline than me. And these 2 timelines are now going to butt heads, and one of them is going to disappear. And as I'm looking at him, I said, I don't say you're lying. All I'm saying is the reality you think you've just lived is coming to an end. You got about 30 seconds. And I told his buddy, look up on the internet. Tell me who won the championship in 91, 92, and 93. And he starts going through it. And I said, now, I realize this is going to come as a shock to you, but the Bulls won those 3 championships. And then they won 3 more after that. And the Lakers just collapsed when they played the Bulls. I'm sorry, that's what happened. And he's like, that's not possible. And he starts getting a little angry. That's not true. And his buddy looks at his phone and goes, dude, and he holds the phone up, and there it is. The Bulls won 91, 92, 93. Jordan went to play baseball for a year, then took another year getting back into shape, and then they won 96, 97, 98.
Wow.
Sorry. And this guy was like shook. It would be like I just told you, you're not living in your house. You're living somewhere in a different town. It shook him to his core. And I realized there are times where you can change reality. You can change your timeline. You can do one little thing that changes everything. It just does. I don't know how that happens. I can't explain it, only to say that it did. And
in your bio, you said you're a little bit psychic, so you have some psychic abilities. So do you think that's what happened?
I'm not sure that was psychic. I know that there are probably 200 people that were in that restaurant that day who heard me yell and heard me knock them down, knock those Laker player fans, wives, people down to a point where they were literally defeated. And they carried that defeatism back to the team. And that maybe not, I don't know, led to the Bulls winning that championship. And here comes a guy who I've never met before, who's absolutely certain beyond a shadow of a doubt with all of the knowledge he has about sports that timeline did not exist. I'll give you another example of something that's just an oddity that happens that suggests that sometimes the right person in the right place can change things and make things happen that otherwise would not have happened. So I want to say this was 1983, I was a Cubs fan sitting in the right field bleachers at Wrigley Field. The Cubs were playing the New York Mets. And in right field for the Mets was a guy named Joel Youngblood, who's a pretty good journeyman player who happens to be in the Hall of Fame because of me. And what happened that day was, as I'm sitting in the right field bleachers, it's like $5 for a seat. The beers are only $1 a piece. After $10, some people have $5 worth of beer in them, and they get a little ornery. And they're yelling at Joel Youngblood and they're swearing at him. And I'm like, hey, there's kids here. You don't have to swear at him. You can do something more creative. And they're like, oh yeah, like what? And I said, allow me. And at the time, I used to do singing telegrams. For a while, I've told people, I was the longest continually employed singing telegram messenger east of San Francisco. I did singing telegrams for about 6 years. So I was used to being in front of a large crowd and singing at the top of my lungs. So while Joe Youngblood is out there waiting for the pitcher to make his pitch, I stood up and I started singing, Youngblood, get off of our field. Your skills in baseball are so unreal. Better run, Blood. You're just no good, Blood. And everybody starts laughing. They're hooting and hollering, and you can see him. He puts his head down and shakes his head, and he turns around and looks at me, and just then there's a clap of the bat, and the ball gets hit. It could have gone anywhere in that field. It went right at Joel Youngblood, and he turns around, and the ball sails over his head, bounces off the ivy. Guy gets a double. Everybody's laughing their ass off at Joel Youngblood, who's so busy looking at some guy up in the stands that he's not paying attention to the game. He gets back in the dugout. The coach is so pissed, they fire him on the spot. They trade to Montreal during the game, and he leaves before the game is over. Now, the interesting part of this is he had gotten a hit that day off of Ferguson Jenkins, who is a Hall of Fame pitcher for the Cubs. They just revealed or unveiled a new statue of Fergie Jenkins outside of Wrigley Field. He goes to Philadelphia, where the team he's just been traded to, Montreal, is playing the Phillies. And he gets a hit there against Mike Schmidt, who's also a Hall of Fame pitcher. And he then becomes the first player in baseball history to get 2 hits in 2 games in 2 different cities in the same day. And he's now in the Hall of Fame because of that.
So words do count.
He shows up, next time he's in Chicago with Montreal, I go out to see him, and I'm up in the stands and I'm going, Joel, yo, it's me, dude. He's like, man, I got to thank you. You got me something I never would have done otherwise. And we were laughing about it. But it happened in a way that it could have only happened at that moment. If I had waited 10 seconds, after the hit was played, it would have been nothing. Or if I had done it in a different inning, it had to have happened right at that moment when that ball is hit, and it had to have gone right over his head as he's looking at me. And all it says is that there are moments in time where you can do something and you can change history. Now, the interesting thing is, if you look this up in the baseball stats, it says incorrectly that Joel Youngblood was playing center field that day. And there's no mention of a guy singing Youngblood, get off of our field. It just mentions he was traded in the middle of the game. It doesn't say why, and it doesn't explain how this is extremely rare that somebody could get kicked off a team in the middle of the game, especially somebody as useful as Joel Youngblood. But that's what happened.
David, do you feel this before you say it? Do you know what you're saying, or what effect it'll have? No,
absolutely not. No, except when I did that thing with the Bulls and the Lakers players, fans, wives. It was like building up, and it bothered me that nobody else in the room was saying anything. Everybody felt defeated except these knuckleheads in the middle, and I felt like I got to do something. I don't know if anybody else is going to do something, but I'm here, so I'll do something. And with Joel Youngblood, it just kind of happened. And I'm sure that WGN somewhere has a tape of this game that shows this moment. And I was loud. I mean, I was really loud. And there was a lull in the game. I'm pretty sure you could hear me all the way across the stadium.
You must have had
that's on tape somewhere.
You must have had a seat where it was down near the field, right? You didn't?
Oh, no, I'm just loud. I'm just very loud. And it's a beautiful stadium to reflect sound off of. So if you are loud enough, you can be heard for a long ways.
Wow. Mm.
So those kind of moments, and I don't know how to describe it other than it's more than just synchronicity. It's more than just items lighting up at the same place, the same time, like tumblers in a lock. It's more than that. It's wanting them. It's taking the moment of opportunity to make them line up, to make those things happen.
Mm-hmm.
There have been other instances where synchronicity like that has happened. Um, we were talking about paranormal experiences. I was in a group of people that were studying what's called wakeful dreaming in Chicago, which is basically taking control of your dreams from within, okay? Which
Mm-hmm.
you can do.
Yes.
If you're in a dream, you can tell yourself, I don't like the way it's going, I'm gonna go this other direction. And it'll do that, but it takes a little bit of training. So at the last day that we had our last class, we all got together, there were about 15 of us or so, at this coffee shop in Chicago. And the lady who was our instructor decided she was going to give us a test. So she took off a ring that she wore on her, I want to say it was her index finger on her left hand. She didn't wear it on her ring finger. She wore it on her left hand on the index finger. And she passed this ring around this group of people who were sitting in a circle around this table. I was sitting opposite her. And the first guy looks at it and it looks like a wedding ring. So he goes, oh, I see a happy couple and a bride in white. And the next person says, oh, I see this, pretty much the same thing. And they all see the same happy, bride cutting a cake and a honeymoon and all that. It gets to me. And as soon as I touch this ring, I feel like somebody's throwing a brick across the room. And I put the ring down. And she says, what's the matter? I said, I don't think I should touch this ring. I don't know if I'm getting a good reading on it.
Uh-huh.
She goes, what did you see? And so I picked it up and I said, I can feel somebody throwing this ring at somebody's head. And they're like, the people around the table like, oh, that's crazy. And she gets real quiet and she goes, that was my wedding ring. The day my husband asked for a divorce, I took it off and I threw it at his head. And I said, okay, I'm done. She goes, no, keep going. So I'm like, okay. So I pick up this ring and I'm holding it. And it's like an on-off switch. Either you get something or you don't.
Right.
And I got this image of a house with a white picket fence and a couple of wooden pillars and a dusty road and a cornfield that went off forever. And a porch swing that wasn't perpendicular to the house. It was parallel to the house, which is kind of odd because if you swung backwards, you'd hit the house. And I described this to her. She goes, that was my grandmother's house. That was my grandmother's ring. And I said, that's cool. And I said, okay, I'm going to retire now. I'm not going to do this anymore. It was scary. It's like getting in a car and realizing that if you touch the gas, it'll go 110 miles an hour with no brakes. That's what it felt. Okay. So about a month later, this same group gets together on a boat on Lake Michigan. Okay. We're all having a party on the boat. And this one guy who was part of the group comes up and he's drunk and he goes, here's my watch. Tell me my future. I said, no, it doesn't work that way. He says, look at it anyway. So I'm holding his watch. And the first image I got was of a bear biting this guy's hand. And I said, I don't know if that means anything to you. And he sobers up really quick. He goes, well, not really, but I bought this at a used watch shop. Maybe it was the previous owner. I said, really? So I held on to it again. And I got this very clear image of a peaked roof, like a third floor walk-up, and a square window with wooden pieces in the middle, and somebody working by a light late at night studying. And I explained this to him, and he goes, oh, that's where I was in college. I said, but you didn't have this watch then. He goes, no, I had my dad's watch. I said, well, where's your dad's watch? Well, it doesn't work anymore. And I gave him the watch back and said, sell this one, get that other one fixed. And he goes, yeah, I'll do that. Okay. So then I said, okay, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. This is scary. And he comes back about 10 minutes later and he's dragging this woman and he goes, do her. I'm like, no, it's not a carnival trick. It doesn't work. I said, okay, but I swear I'm not doing this anymore. It's the last time. So she gives me this weird necklace that's made out of black spheres, like black pearls. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to see anything, but if I do, I'll let you know. So I hold on to this, and the first image I get within seconds is of a guy falling off a railing on a boat. And I explained this to her, and she goes, no way. I said, does it mean something? She goes, the guy that gave her that necklace fell off the boat right after he gave it to her.
Oh,
So,
you're
so I'm
good.
like, oh, okay, I'm done. Okay, time out. No more, please, no more, no more. And what this means is humans have that ability. If I can do it, other people
Yeah,
can.
you're, you
I'm
can
not
be.
special. I'm just one person. Anybody can do this. It's just you have to have the right openness, open-mindedness, or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Consciousness, and you got to be a little telepathic. I think that's what your talents are, maybe.
I think telepathy is just one facet of a larger set. It's like saying to be a great basketball player, you got to be able to jump. Well, you got to be able to run. You got to be able to dribble the ball. You got to be able to pass. You got to have good peripheral vision. You have to have a lot of skills.
Hmm.
So telepathy is just one skill. I know at least on 3 occasions, I've had my life saved by something that communicated to me to do something else or else. And
All those
that,
angels or guides.
I don't know. I don't know. It could just be your gut instinct, but what's your gut instinct? Who knows what that is?
Mhm.
I was about ready to pull a tree down that my brother and I were cutting down in our backyard in Range, Illinois. And I had this chain wrapped around my waist because I thought I would brace myself to do this. And just as this thing begins to crack and starts coming down, this voice says, I don't think that's a really good idea. And I looked down and I realized, if this tree goes the wrong way, this chain's going to tighten and it's going to cut me in half.
Yeah.
Once
Right.
I realized that, I start loosening the chain really, really fast. And I got it down to my feet, and I just got my feet out when this tree went the wrong way, and it ripped this chain like a motorboat launch. It just, and it would have killed me.
Right. I
And
didn't
the
know this. Yeah, I didn't know this about you, David. Other times that I've talked to you, that you have these abilities, to see things and to feel things, and I think that consciousness is probably what drew the Men in Black to you.
no, I think they were pissed that I kept making jokes about the Men in Black in our magazine.
Oh,
We had a section in our magazine called the Men in Black. I think they
okay.
wanted to say, maybe you should just lay off this for a while,
Yeah.
which is fine because I wound up diving into archaeology. And I think there are questions about ancient archaeology that are similar to the questions about UFOs.
Right.
Is this and I think we've also gotten to another paradigm moment in UFOs similar to the paradigm we're reaching now in ancient archaeology, where we have to get past the idea that did somebody build these things with technology that was not available to the people that lived in the area at the time, and we have to just say yes and move past that and say yes, they did. What technology did they use? Where did it go? And why does it look like they all left in a hurry? And does that have something to do with this massive devastation that may have raised the ocean levels 200 or 300 feet in a very short amount of time? They may all be joined together. That paradigm also has to be looked at in the same way that we look at the UFO paradigm. We have to stop arguing about whether UFOs are here, because they are. And
Yes.
they've been here for a while. We also have to stop believing whatever the Pentagon tells us, because the Pentagon is lying to us. They are not telling us the truth. And I've got a list of 4 or 5 events that if the Pentagon really wanted to tell us the truth, if they really wanted to be open with us, they could just take these 5 events and nothing else, and just share the data that they have on these 5 events, and they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt they're here, but they're not doing that. They're specifically leaving us with these awful UAP videos, which
Right.
are not UFOs and do not describe what the people who have claimed to have seen these Tic Tac objects, these videos do not show that. And this is a harsh thing for me to say, and I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for saying it, the Air Force officers know that this is not what they received. That's what bothers me. And that's why I think only a handful of Air Force officers have come forward, because they're not being honest. That's not a Tic Tac UFO in that UFO video. That's not even a UFO. It's an airplane, for crying out loud. And so is that one. And that one is an artifact of a camera that has the window close up so it looks like triangles.
So you're thinking that they're blowing up smoke screens to us.
Yep. And they've been doing that since 1941. Not 47 with Roswell, not 42 with the Battle of Los Angeles, 41 with an incident that very few people know about. And I think that's where it started.
Okay, we're going to take a break, a short pause here on a WODY radio, Odyssey Radio out of Maryland. And you've been listening to David White telling us all this interesting information, a different slant on things, I guess. And also I'm learning more about him on these abilities that he's have. This is Dave Emmons, Dave Emmons Show. We'll be right back after this pause. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. We got one more segment left here to go, and David White is talking about a lot of his, I guess, investigations and also his life and what has transpired in his life with these different types of synchronicities. This is Dave Emmons, the Dave Emmons Show, and WODY Radio from Maryland, and it's Odyssey Radio. David, I guess we were starting to talk a little bit about ETs off and on, but let's go into the disclosure thing that you want to talk about.
Absolutely. So I want to start by saying I believe 100% that depending on how you want to define it, non-human intelligences, non-terrestrial visitors, whatever you want to call them, ETs, aliens, there's a large number of things that we could describe them as something, somebody, someone is visiting us. When you look at the planet that we inhabit, it's heaven. This is the Garden of Eden. We have an axis that gives us both a spring, summer, and a fall, winter time period and seasons that is unusual from what we can tell. Like, for example, none of the other planets in our solar system have an alternating like this. We have some planets that are not completely on their side, and we have some that are tidally locked, like Mercury. But only a planet like this will allow you to have unusual species that can, for example, migrate, or they can, like trees, like deciduous trees, will drop their leaves in the winter because they don't want the snow to break their branches. And this planet sitting in the Goldilocks zone with liquid water is a rarity. And we not only have that planet, but we also have an advanced civilization that can put rockets into space and land on other celestial bodies.
Right.
If there are smart people, smart sentient races in the universe, of course they're going to visit us. And they could see from 1 billion years ago that this is the way that this planet was going to be. Not only that, but we're also stupid as hell, and we're shooting off things like atomic bombs and blowing things up and destroying our planet from within because of the carbon buildup, the carbon dioxide buildup in our planet's atmosphere,
Right.
where we're going to need help. Okay, we're already reaching, in India, they had temperatures of 140 degrees this year. 140. That ain't centigrade, that's Fahrenheit.
Can't live in
110
that.
degrees, your brain starts melting.
Right.
120 degrees, you're going to pass out. 140, you're not going to survive.
Right.
And we're having those problems. We're having the worst wildfires Mexico has ever seen. We've got the worst drought in the West in recorded history. As far as we can tell, in the last 2,000 years, this multi-decade drought that's been going on is the worst we've ever seen. We're going to need help. The problem is we're not getting any help, at least not that kind of help, because the ones that they would have to contact, our government, is lying to us. And I'm sorry, I hate to have to say this. I know other people have said the same thing. But if our government, if our Pentagon, if the United States military really wanted to share with us what they knew, there's about 5 incidences where they could just share whatever they have data-wise, and they wouldn't have to ever tell us anything more. They would be able to convince the world. And I'm just going to read off a list, okay?
David, there's some scientists who say this is cyclic. It happens every 12, 15,000 years, maybe, and we're into that area now. Do you believe that?
Well, there's, other than the megalithic stonework that I talked about, there really is no evidence that we can see on land of civilizations reaching this level. There are legends that they did. There are legends of flying beasts and flying craft and fights in the sky and nuclear, what appears to be nuclear explosions, but there's no real physical evidence above ground. It's possible that once we start investigating some of these cities underwater that may have existed prior to 10,000 BC, that maybe we'll find some of this evidence. But it's frustrating that we can't find any of this evidence. The other problem is we know, we believe very strongly, that multiple craft have crashed on this planet that are not of earthly origin, and yet we can't find that debris. that debris has been taken away from us. We have plenty of evidence of the government, the US government, for example, rounding up any pieces of debris of the Roswell crash. Well, if that was just a weather balloon, what the heck are they doing, hammering people 5, 10 years later? Tell me what's in that box under your bed. Give it to me right now.
Mhm.
That kind of stuff. If it's a weather balloon, dude, they're not doing it. If it was a weather balloon, why did they destroy 6 months of incoming and outgoing transmissions for the entire Roswell Army Air Force Base? Oh, just an accident. Baloney, that was just an accident. If that was just a hot air balloon or a weather balloon, why have there been so many deathbed confessions of so many normal people who say, I helped pick up that wreckage. My husband helped pick up that wreckage, and he was a broken man from that point on.
Right.
And on and on and on. I had this opportunity a couple of years ago, 2017, to talk to Nick Redfern, who was on a podcast. And he had just come out with a second book trying to explain away Roswell. The first book was, I believe it was Bodies in the Desert. And his theory at the time got shot full of holes by every researcher on UFOs because his theory does not hold water. He was told, supposedly by 3 anonymous sources, and anonymous sources are not worth very much, that the actual Roswell event was us using Japanese scientists that we had captured after World War II or during World War II, and that they were experimenting on Chinese prisoners with radiation experiments, and that what fell to Earth was like this gondola, and it had burnt bodies in it because they were irradiated. And there are so many things wrong with that he just got hammered, and he had to come out with a second book that tried to support the first one. It doesn't work. And so when I had a chance to talk to him, I said, look, Nick, I don't want to argue about whether this happened or whether that happened. What I want to talk about, I just want to get past that. And I want to talk about the fact that somebody in our government is still trying to cover up Roswell. This is, depending on how you count, the 5th or the 6th explanation of what happened. And every single one before that, they admit, well, we were lying. Well, it wasn't this, it was this. Well, no, that wasn't true either. It was this. Well, no, that was wrong too. It's just one lie after another. And I
David,
said, let's assume.
do you think this way about all throughout our history? They've lied to us. You got high priest, you got
No.
people that keep secrets away from us.
No,
And
I don't
also,
think so.
and the giant skeletons that the government takes away and puts them somewhere in some basement of a museum.
The giant skeletons, I'm still unconvinced, because there is evidence of newspapers at the time printing whatever they could in order to sell newspapers. It's pretty much the same thing you see on YouTube these days. People will put anything on YouTube, but that doesn't mean it's real.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I asked Nick Redfern, I said, let's assume this is the 5th or 6th in a series of cover-ups that the Air Force and the government is trying to cover up Roswell with. If this is true, there's only 2 logical reasons that I could assume that they're covering it up. A, it's something so horrible and horrific that even now we can't admit it, which could be your story, but your story doesn't hold water. But we've admitted things like the Tuskegee Airmen experiment, where we gave Black people syphilis and let them die in horrible agony just to see what happens. It's like, how horrible is that? We admitted that. It took us decades to admit it, but we admitted it. The CIA's admitted a whole bunch of things that were just horrible, illegal experiments on people. We've admitted all those. Why can't we admit Roswell if it was something scientific or medical? Which leads me to point 2. If it ain't that, then it is a crash craft of some sort. And he accepted that and said, that's funny you would ask that. I've asked myself that. Why are they still trying to cover this up? Why are they still trying to give us these bizarre theories, each one more bizarre than the one before? Okay, so we have that, but that's Roswell, and there's been so much thrown up against Roswell that it's become an icon unto itself. So I would rather look at other events. One of the best events to prove that the military is not talking to us honestly and directly and openly is the Phoenix Lights event. And the Phoenix Lights event, for people who don't know it, happened in, I have to check my notes here just to make sure I'm correct, March 13th, 1997.
Yeah, that's
And
it.
most people think when they hear Phoenix Lights the story that's been trumpeted by the media more often than not, which is these 5 glowing white magnesium flares that appeared at 10 o'clock at night that night west of Phoenix, and then descend slowly and then disappear behind the hills west of town. Except that's not the first Phoenix Light event that happened that day. The first Phoenix Light event happened from, let's say, 6 o'clock to roughly 8 o'clock, and extended over 300 miles
Yes.
from the Nevada area all the way into Phoenix and Tucson, and then turned around and went back.
Yes.
And thousands of people saw this. They were calling newspapers, they were calling the TV stations, they were calling the police. And at some point, somebody in the military went, we can't talk about this, send up an A-10. And they send an A-10 out and they drop a bunch of magnesium flares, and then they go, yeah, that's what it was. And then the next morning, the governor, Republican Governor Fife Symington,
Right.
has a press conference where he says, we have found the pilot of that craft last night. And he trots out one of his aides wearing an alien costume.
Try to make fun of it.
Ha, 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 ha. That's funny. Oh, boy. And they basically try to bury it. That's our government trying to hide the truth. If they wanted to tell us the truth at the congressional hearings, and I have to apologize if I sound a little heated here, but I don't like it when our government continues to lie about something that the whole world needs to know about.
Did you hear the story, David, about the Phoenix Triangle? They did send up 2 jets, 2 jet fighters and 2 pilots. They went up and took a look at this thing, and they got close to it, and they said, wow, it's huge. And they told the ground people, they said, it's huge. And the commander there said, do not fire on it.
Do not engage.
Fire on it. So they turned around, come back to the base. And when they got out of their planes, they were all shook up. So
why aren't we discussing that in front of a congressional hearing? Why are we discussing these stupid UAP videos, which every single one of those 5 videos has a mundane explanation?
Yeah.
Why they trot those out specifically to make UFO believers look bad. And by the way, I have to bring a little criticism to the UFO community. And I pointed this out multiple times since 2017 when these UAP videos started coming out. The problem lies with us. The problem started back, and it's perfectly illustrated by the poster on Fox Mulder's wall in X-Files. It doesn't say, I want the truth. It doesn't say, I want contact or disclosure. It says, I want to believe.
Right.
Anybody can believe, but the problem is, what do you believe? And the Pentagon has proven people will believe the worst stuff if you tell them it's the real thing. Well, it's not the real thing. The problem that bothers me is, why do we have Air Force pilots saying, oh yeah, that's my Tic Tac UFO video, when it's clearly not the Tic Tac UFO video? Why do you have a video of these guys laughing when they finally get something on their radar lock-on, and you only get 10 seconds, and as soon as they start laughing, it cuts off? Give me the next 30 seconds where they realize, oh, they just locked onto a duck. Why don't I hear that? Why did they only show us a little bit? Because they're messing with us. They're deliberately making UFO researchers look bad. And
right. What I found out, David, with a lot of these UFO investigators or people that are amateurs involved in this thing, I've seen 6 up close UFOs. So I don't want to look at orbs anymore. Don't tell me about orbs. I've seen them up close. So yeah. And a lot of these people are still 20 years behind where I'm at because I'm an experiencer. And these people are just catching on to like videos they're sending me that's 5 or 6 years old. And I don't want to be crude and say, no, I know all that. I want to advance. You know, I want to level that I want to advance. We are our worst enemies.
Right. How about the 2008 Stephenville sightings, where this thing as big as a super Walmart, according to one pilot on the ground who witnessed this, which is flashing illuminated glyphs on the side of this vertical wall,
right?
So that it's trying to communicate to people. Why aren't we discussing that in the congressional hearings? Why aren't we discussing the fact that 2 F-16s on Afterburner chased this thing, couldn't catch up with it, and it buzzed the Bush Ranch in Crawford, Texas? Why are we talking about that? Why aren't we talking about the fact that the FAA lied repeatedly to a judge who was overseeing a Freedom of Information Act request, where at first they said, oh, we don't have anything on radar. And then they came back and the judge says, show me something. Oh, well, we got a couple of F-16s. And then the judge is like, not good enough, try again. And then they went, well, the F-16s were messing around with their afterburner, sure, but there's no UFO. And the judge finally goes, maybe I should put your asses in jail for a little while. Maybe your memory would improve.
Yeah.
And then they finally go, okay, here it is. And there is a massive UFO on this radar tape.
Mhm.
Why didn't they come forward with that? Why don't we talk about whoever in the FAA wouldn't release these tapes and what the chain of command was that prohibited him from releasing them? We should talk about that, but they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about these 5 UAPs. But that one incident right there, let's analyze that. Let's see what the radar data says from the ground. Let's see what the F-16 pilots had to say. Did they see this thing up close? Could they see any glyphs? Where did this thing go after 8 o'clock? Because the FOA requests only went up to 8 p.m. that night. Where did this craft go after that? You can't tell me that this craft was not on radar, because we know it was. Where did it go after that? Did it go straight up like some UFOs do? Go straight up to 200,000 feet and then disappear off of radar? Why aren't we talking about those? Because I guarantee you, that ain't a drone. And that's definitely not terrestrial. We don't have anything except rockets. And even the rockets don't go straight up. They kind of go off at an angle so that it takes them a little while to ascend. We can't send a rocket straight up to 200,000. And if they want to talk about the Nimitz event, well, then show me the radar data from the Princeton. Show me the radar data from the Nimitz itself. Show me the electronic warfare expert data from one of the planes that was with the FAA teams. Why don't you share this data? You can't tell me that stuff's classified. It's 20 years old. It's not classified. If you're releasing those UAP videos, that stuff is no more sensitive to that. It's not classified.
I think the government likes this disinformation and misinformation that we're involved in now with the fake news. They enjoy it because they can bury all this stuff in there that you're talking about, the reality of the UFOs.
I have to say that's exactly true. Yeah. So we have to get past the point where we have to, argue about whether UFOs exist or not. Yes, they do. Okay. We have to get past the point about whether the Pentagon's lying to us or not. Yes, they are. They have so much information that they're not. One of the little points I want to touch on, which kind of brings into this discussion something serious, is there's a CIA file called the Family Jewels, which was put together in 1973. It's a 700-page, roughly, document that you can actually get from the CIA website right now. You can download. It was because James Schlesinger, who was the CIA chief at the time, was getting hammered in the church hearings that Congress was holding about all the illegal stuff the CIA was doing, that their charter specifically says you will not do this, like spying on Americans, like trying to assassinate people, like subverting foreign governments, all this kind of stuff. And Schlesinger says, okay, that's it. I'm not going to get blindsided anymore. I want on my desk everything that we did that was not accepted by our charter. I want to have it. I want to have it complete. And I want to have it, I'll give you 2 hours, short period of time. So they put together this document called the Family Jewels, which was never supposed to get out beyond the CIA, but for whatever reason, it got released. And it talks about trying to assassinate Castro. It talks about, overthrowing the government in Chile and in Iran. And it talks about using LSD on a town in France where they dosed the entire town through their water supply. Didn't ask, didn't tell the French, just did it, and tons and tons of horrible stuff, except number one. And the number one thing that they admitted to Schlesinger is redacted, a big black box. They talk about everything else that could have actually gotten the CIA decertified. It could have actually closed the CIA down permanently, but there was one thing that they would not talk about. And there are other pages that show documentation for all these projects that they underwent, except the page for number one, which is a complete black box. They never talked openly about what that was. There are only 2 things that the Family Jewels do not discuss: UFOs and the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
It's one of those 2. Mm-hmm. Now, my money is on the Kennedy assassination because, frankly, I don't think the CIA in '73 had a good enough idea of what they were really doing with UFOs. I could be wrong. I think it's the Kennedy assassination. I think it's basically we had some rogue agents. It wasn't us. It was rogue agents who worked with the mafia to kill Kennedy.
Did you say 73 or 63?
73.
73. Oh, that's when they had a hearing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But it just goes to show that our government cannot be completely truthful with us. And we now have, since 2017, we've had at least 3 that I know of, Tic Tac events that have involved commercial airliners, where it looks like our government is trying to duplicate what we claimed we saw in 2004. Now, it's interesting, nothing was released from 2004 until August of 2017. And then 3 months later, there's a very interesting event that happens from Las Vegas, roughly Area 51-ish, where a tubular white Tic Tac shaped object starts going at more than Mach 1 towards California, makes a hard right-hand turn at more than Mach 1, which most planes can't do, and drops off of radar. And at that point, commercial airliners, which are flying from California to Oregon and Washington State, start seeing this thing at about 3 miles away. They can't pick up any details. They can't see any control surfaces. But this white tubular thing is really rocketing. It's just going, but it looks like it's specifically close enough for them to see it, but far enough away that they can't make out any details. Now, normally, like, for example, Stevensville, when the MUFON or another organization submits a Freedom of Information Act request, it's like pulling teeth to get the damn FAA to comply. But in this instance, not only does the FAA comply, they actually released both the radar transepts and the voice cockpit recordings between the pilots, the FAA controllers, and a guy who's in charge of military assets in the area, whose title, whose handle is redacted. They actually use it twice, and it's redacted both times. And he actually vectors in armed jets and tells the FAA people to get your planes out of the area. And the FAA guy says, how the hell do we do that? Because they've never practiced this before. So releasing this tape the way that the FAA did makes us look bad, makes us look incompetent and unprepared. And they did this specifically because they wanted, the military, wanted our adversaries, primarily Russia and China, to think that we have back engineered this device, which we just talked about 3 months ago for the very first time. And when this stuff is released in December of 2018, within 2 weeks, Vladimir Putin puts out his little press conference where he goes, oh, you got the stealthy rocket. We got stealthy nuclear powered rocket.
Right.
It can orbit Earth forever. This is the Kronos rocket that they have, which frankly falls into the ocean more times than not. And when he showed it with a big target right over Florida where Mar-a-Lago is.
Yeah.
And since then, we've seen this same tubular white rocket thing flying only in a straight line. It never does any erratic movements. It's only just very fast in a straight line. We've seen it over, I believe, New Mexico and Arizona. And again, as if it's buzzing commercial airlines. So what I believe happened in 2017 when the Pentagon began releasing these quote unquote Tic Tac videos, which they may have hoped might be better received by the public. They were trying to say, oh yeah, it came out of Area 51. So we must be flying these, and China, you better not attack us, and Russia, watch out.
Yeah.
And it's bogus.
Yeah, it's something that they have a smoke screen on us. They don't, there's a couple of theories. They don't want to tell us because they don't want people jumping out the windows committing suicide because we have aliens coming here and landing and communicating with us. They're afraid of that. They're saying they're afraid of that, but I don't think people will do that now. I think we're getting a little bit better conditioned. The other thing is they don't want the other foreign enemies to know exactly what's going on. They want to keep them in the dark about our technology. Our technology is good. You can take a look at the Russian military technology right now and not doing a very good show of things.
It's not technology, is potato.
Yeah. So this, so how strong do we think Russia really is? Getting their butts kicked by Ukraine. And so
they have a lot of artillery. They have a lot of artillery. That's what's pushing Ukrainians back right now, is wheel to wheel, axle to axle artillery fire. Right. And we have to be able to give something to Ukraine to be able to counter that. Mm-hmm. Even if it's missiles that have to travel 35, 40 miles and might hit Russia, we have to give Ukraine what they can do to fight back against Russia.
And what about this theory that we're about 20 years behind the military's technology? They don't tell us until about 20 years later.
Well, it depends on what they have. It depends on who we can believe. Do we believe Bob Lazar when he says, I saw 9 UFOs, including one that looks like the sport model with a hole drilled in it, like somebody shot a cannonball at?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Do we believe that? Do we believe other people like Phil Schneider, who says that were living in Dulce and had multiple levels? If we had more time, if we had another half hour, I'd tell you what the second in command of the Lamont Police Department told me in confidence, that he was debriefed when he saw a UFO in 1991 in Lamont, Illinois. And he was not somebody that easily makes things up. He was the second in command of the police department and was the highest decorated officer that that department had at the time. He saved a whole bunch of lives by spotting a tornado that nobody else spotted. And because he gave them 30 seconds of warning, about 100 people saved from that tornado.
Yeah.
He's a very serious, down-to-earth guy. He told me stories that he was told in confidence. Doesn't sound like we know everything the government's got, if he can be believed, if they didn't lie to him, which they may have.
Right. I think with those experiencers, yeah, with the experiencers, the government doesn't take us really serious, and they like us to make fools out of ourselves in order to show people that, we're not telling the truth.
They take us serious. They just don't want us to share the truth that we know.
Right. Yeah. But it's like all the information we have, a lot of experiencers. I've seen, like I said, 6 craft up close. I've experienced some stuff, and it's kind of like, okay, yeah, we're just kind of running and ruining ourselves, the ufologists. Yep. Okay, we're coming up to the end of the show, and David White has been a great guest as before. I talked to him. He's always interesting, and he has a lot of knowledge. And actually, your website and your books are there all together. I mean, on your website, or do you have certain information in one place?
Well, if you go to my Twitter feed, you'll see most of my work. You can see my writing. You can see my screenplays on the different links there. As of yet, I have still not published a single book or sold a single screenplay. Any agents or publishing companies out there, please knock down my door.
Okay, great. This is Dave Emmons with the Dave Emmons Show here on WODY Radio, and it's actually Odyssey Radio out of Maryland. We thank you for listening. Good night, everybody.